The clash of steel echoed through the valley as Marcus drove his war hammer into the enemy's shield. Blood mixed with mud beneath his boots, and the screams of dying men filled the air like thunder. At 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad as an oak tree, he towered over every warrior on the battlefield. His massive frame cast shadows that made grown men tremble, and his voice could shake mountains when he roared commands to his tribe. But tonight, as he cleaned enemy blood from his weapon by the dying light of their campfire, something felt different. Something felt empty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers as Marcus led his hunting party through the ancient woods. 3 days had passed since their victory over the Iron Claw tribe, and his warriors needed fresh meat before they could return home to the mountain stronghold. The weight of leadership sat heavy on his shoulders, heavier than the massive sword strapped across his back, or the battle scars that covered his arms, like a roadmap of violence. Marcus paused at the edge of a small clearing, his keen eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Behind him, his men waited in silence, their respect for their giant leader absolute and unquestioned. For 15 years, he had led the Stone Wolf tribe through countless battles, earning his place as chieftain through strength, cunning, and an iron will that bent to no one. His word was law, his presence commanded fear, and his hammer had never failed to bring victory. Yet something nagged at him today, a restlessness he could not name. The sound came first as a whisper through the trees. Not the rustle of leaves or the call of birds, but something human, something broken. Marcus held up his massive fist, and his warriors froze instantly. He tilted his head, listening with the patience of a predator. There it was again, a soft sob, quickly stifled, coming from beyond the thick grove of pine trees ahead. "Wait here," Marcus commanded, his voice a low rumble that carried the authority of absolute power. His men nodded without question, though. He caught the concerned glances they exchanged. Their leader never investigated sounds alone, never took unnecessary risks. But something about this particular sound pulled at him in a way he did not understand. Marcus moved through the forest with surprising grace for such a large man. Years of hunting and warfare had taught him to step lightly despite his size, to move like a shadow when necessary. The sound grew clearer as he approached, definitely human, definitely distressed. His hand instinctively moved to the handle of his warhammer, muscles tensing for potential combat. What he found beyond the pine grove stopped him cold. A small figure knelt beside a stream, shoulders shaking with silent tears. The person wore a torn brown cloak that had once been fine wool, now stained with mud and what looked like blood. Dark hair fell in tangled waves around a face turned down toward the water, and Marcus could see small hands trembling as they tried to wash wounds that looked fresh and painful. It was a woman, he realized, though her age was difficult to determine. From his position behind the trees, she was alone, vulnerable, and clearly hurt. Every instinct Marcus possessed screamed at him to approach with caution. Lone travelers in these woods were often bait for ambushes, and he had learned long ago that showing mercy to strangers could be a fatal mistake. But as he watched her struggle to clean a deep gash on her arm, wincing with each touch of the cold water, something unexpected stirred in his chest. Not pity, he had crushed that weakness out of himself years ago. Not desire, though even from a distance he could see she possessed a rare beauty. It was something else entirely, something that made his breath catch and his heart pound in a rhythm he had never felt before. The woman suddenly stiffened, her head snapping up as if sensing his presence. When she turned toward his hiding place, Marcus felt the full force of her gaze like a physical blow. Her eyes were the deep green of forest shadows, wide with fear, but burning with a fierce intelligence that took his breath away. Even terrified and wounded, she held herself with a dignity that spoke of noble birth, of strength that went deeper than muscle and bone. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small clearing. Marcus found himself unable to move, unable to speak, pinned in place by those extraordinary eyes. She should have screamed, should have run or begged for mercy. Instead, she slowly rose to her feet, her chin lifting in defiance despite the way. Her body swayed with exhaustion. "I know you're there," she said, and her voice was like honey over steel, soft but unbreakable. "If you mean to kill me, at least have the courage to show your face." The challenge in her words sparked something primal in Marcus's warrior soul. No one spoke to him with such boldness, such complete lack of fear. Kings and chieftains bowed before him. Enemies fled at the sight of his massive frame. But the slip of a woman faced him down as if she were his equal. Marcus stepped from the shadows, and he heard her sharp intake of breath as his full size became apparent. He stood nearly 2 feet taller than her, his presence filling the clearing like a mountain given human form. His long black hair was bound with leather cords, his beard was braided with small bones taken from fallen enemies, and his arms bore the ritual scars of his tribe. He was death incarnate, and he knew it. But she did not run. Instead, she studied him with those penetrating green eyes, taking in every detail of his appearance with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger quickly and accurately. Her gaze lingered on the hammer at his belt, the tribal markings on his face, the fresh bloodstains on his leather armor that spoke of recent battle. "Stone Wolf," she said quietly, and Marcus felt surprise ripple through him. Few outside his tribe could identify their markings so quickly. "You're far from your mountain home, warrior." "As are you from yours, lady," Marcus replied, his voice gentler than he had intended. The formal address came naturally, despite her bedraggled appearance. Everything about her bearing screamed nobility. "These woods are dangerous for one traveling alone." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, and she gestured to her wounded arm. "I've noticed." She swayed again, and Marcus instinctively stepped forward, his hand reaching out to steady her before he could stop himself. She flinched away from his touch, fear finally showing in her eyes as she fully grasped the size of the hand approaching her. Marcus froze, his massive palm hovering inches from her shoulder, struck by the sudden realization that his hands could span her entire back, that he could snap her neck with barely any effort at all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The thought terrified him. "I won't hurt you," he said, and was startled by the sincerity in his own voice. When had he last made such a promise to anyone? When had he last cared whether someone feared him or not? She searched his face for a long moment, those green eyes seeming to see straight through to his soul. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she slowly nodded and allowed him to place his hand gently on her elbow for support. The contact sent electricity shooting up Marcus's arm. Her skin was soft as silk beneath his calloused palm, warm despite the chill morning air. He could feel her pulse racing through the delicate bones of her wrist, could sense the tremor that ran through her body at his touch. But she did not pull away again, and that simple trust hit him harder than any weapon ever had. "What happened to you?" he asked, his eyes taking in the extent of her injuries. Besides the gash on her arm, he could see bruises on her throat. Scratches on her hands, and the way she favored her left leg suggested more damage hidden beneath her torn clothing. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. Then she spoke, her voice steady despite the pain he could see in her eyes. "Bandits attacked our caravan 3 days ago. They killed my guards, stole everything of value, and left me for dead." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to touch a pendant at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she apparently still possessed. "I've been walking ever since, trying to reach the next settlement." Marcus felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and fierce as a forge fire. The idea of men attacking this woman, of anyone laying violent hands on something so precious, made him want to hunt them down and show them what real violence looked like. The intensity of his anger surprised him. He had felt protective of his tribe members before, but never anything like this burning need to avenge a stranger's pain. Which way did they go? The question emerged as a growl, and he saw her eyes widen at the dangerous tone in his voice. "You don't understand," she said quickly. "There were at least 15 of them, maybe more. They were well-armed, organized. Even someone like you," she gestured at his imposing frame. "It would be suicide to face them alone." Marcus almost smiled at that. If she only knew how many men he had faced single-handedly, how many armies had fallen before his hammer. But something in her concern for his safety, misplaced though it was, warmed a part of his heart he had thought long dead. "I don't travel alone," he said simply. "My hunting party waits nearby, and 15 bandits are barely worth my time." She stared at him as if he had claimed the ability to fly, then shook her head in disbelief. "You speak as if you're some legendary hero from the old songs." "I'm Marcus," he said, and watched her eyes widen as recognition dawned. Even in these remote woods, his name carried weight. Chieftain of the Stone Wolf tribe, Hammer of the Northern Peaks, Breaker of the Iron Claw Confederation. The titles felt strange on his tongue, boastful in a way they never had before. She paled, swaying on her feet as the full implications hit her. She was alone in the woods with one of the most feared warriors in the known world, a man whose very name was whispered in taverns to frighten children. Marcus could see the war between fear and fascination playing out across her delicate features. "And you are?" he prompted gently, trying to keep his voice soft and non-threatening. "Elena," she whispered, then seemed to gather her courage and spoke more firmly. "Elena of Raven's Hollow." Now it was Marcus's turn to feel shock. Raven's Hollow was one of the most powerful kingdoms in the southern lands, and if she truly was nobility from that realm, she was far indeed from home. More importantly, she represented exactly the kind of political value that could start or end wars. "Lady Elena," he said formally, inclining his massive head in what could almost be called a bow, "you're under my protection now." The words came out before he could stop them, carrying the weight of a sacred vow. In his culture, such promises were binding unto death, not given lightly or casually. But as soon as he spoke them, Marcus knew they were true. Something about this woman had reached past all his defenses, past the walls he had built around his heart through years of violence and leadership. She blinked up at him in surprise. "Just like that? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Marcus replied, and realized with startling clarity that it was true. He knew the courage it took to face him without flinching, the strength required to survive 3 days alone in hostile wilderness, the nobility of spirit that shone through her pain like sunlight through storm clouds. "Come, let me tend your wounds properly, and then we'll discuss what happens next." Elena hesitated for a moment longer, those green eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way no enemy had ever managed. Then she nodded slowly, placing her small hand in his massive palm with a trust that humbled him completely. As Marcus led her back toward his waiting warriors, he found himself walking more carefully than usual, adjusting his normal ground-eating stride to match her smaller steps. The simple consideration felt foreign but right, as if some fundamental part of him had shifted without his conscious awareness. His men looked up in surprise as he emerged from the trees with Elena beside him. Marcus could see the questions in their eyes, the confusion at seeing their fearsome leader treating a stranger with such obvious care. But none of them dared voice their curiosity. They had learned long ago not to question his decisions. "Ryan," Marcus called to his second-in-command, a grizzled veteran who had fought beside him for over a decade. "Break out the medical supplies. The lady has been injured." Ryan nodded immediately, moving to comply without hesitation. But Marcus caught the sharp look the older warrior gave him, the silent question about when their chieftain had started, referring to anyone as lady with such reverence in his voice. Marcus guided Elena to a flat stone near their small camp, helping her sit with a gentleness that felt completely natural despite being utterly foreign to his usual behavior. As he knelt beside her to examine her wounds more closely, he was acutely aware of how his massive frame dwarfed her delicate form, how careful he had to be not to hurt her simply through his presence. "This needs cleaning," he said, gently lifting her wounded arm. The gash was deeper than he had first thought, and angry red lines around the edges suggested infection had already begun to set in. "It's going to hurt." Elena met his eyes squarely, no trace of fear in her gaze now. "I can handle pain, Marcus." The way she said his name, soft and warm and completely without the awe or terror it usually inspired, sent shivers down his spine. In that moment, Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about himself, about what he wanted from life, had just been turned completely upside down. As he began cleaning her wounds with hands that shook slightly despite his legendary steadiness, Marcus found himself wondering if this was how mountains felt when earthquakes reshifted their foundations. The woman sitting before him, trusting him with her pain, had somehow managed to do what countless enemies had failed to achieve. She had brought the giant warrior to his knees without striking a single blow. Marcus worked in careful silence as he cleaned Elena's wounds, his massive hands moving with a delicacy that surprised even him. Each time she winced, he felt an answering pain in his own chest, as if her suffering had somehow become connected to his own heartbeat. The antiseptic herbs stung, and he could see her fighting not to cry out, her teeth pressed into her lower lip until it went white. "You can make noise if it helps," he said quietly, not looking up from his work. "My men have heard worse sounds from me when I've been patched up after battle." Elena let out a shaky laugh that held more pain than humor. "I've had plenty of practice staying quiet. In my father's court, showing weakness was often more dangerous than bleeding to death." The bitterness in her voice made Marcus pause in his ministrations. He looked up at her face, noting the way shadows seemed to pass behind her green eyes like clouds across the sun. There were stories there, he realized. Pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "Your father's court sounds like a battlefield," he observed, returning his attention to wrapping her arm with clean linen strips. "It was," Elena replied softly. "Just with different weapons." Marcus finished securing the bandage and sat back on his heels, studying her face. Despite everything she had endured, despite the obvious exhaustion and pain, she held herself with a grace that spoke of years of training. Her spine was straight, her chin lifted, her hands folded in her lap with perfect composure. Even now, battered and alone in the wilderness, she carried herself like royalty. "Tell me about these bandits," Marcus said, settling cross-legged on the ground before her. The position brought him closer to her eye level, though he still towered over her even while seated. "How many exactly? What weapons did they carry?" Elena's expression darkened, and her hand unconsciously moved to touch her throat where faint bruise marks were still visible. "I counted 17 men when they first surrounded our caravan. They moved like soldiers, not common thieves. Their leader wore the markings of a disbanded mercenary company from the Eastern Kingdoms." Marcus frowned. Organized bandits were far more dangerous than desperate criminals, especially if they had military training. "What did they take?" "Everything of value. Gold, jewelry, fine fabrics. They killed my guards without hesitation, as if human life meant nothing to them." Elena's voice grew harder with each word. "They took the other women from our party. Alive, I only escaped because I convinced them I was dead." The rage that had been simmering in Marcus's chest blazed hotter. The idea of those animals laying hands on Elena made him want to paint the forest red with their blood. But her mention of other captives tempered his fury with cold calculation. A rescue mission would require planning, not just brute force. How long ago was this? He asked. 3 days, maybe 4. Time has become difficult to track. Elena looked down at her hands, and Marcus could see them trembling slightly. I keep thinking I should have fought harder, done something more. To help them. You survived, Marcus said firmly. That took courage and intelligence. Don't diminish that. She looked up at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such understanding from a man known primarily for his skill at violence. Most people would say I was cowardly for playing dead while others were taken. Most people are fools. Marcus replied bluntly, a dead hero saves no one. A living survivor can bring justice. The conviction in his voice seemed to steady something in Elena's expression. She straightened slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the steel beneath her silk exterior. Justice. Is that what you're offering? I'm offering whatever you need, Marcus said, the words coming out more intense than he had intended. Those men hurt you. They took innocent people. That cannot stand. Elena studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus found himself holding his breath under her scrutiny. Finally she nodded slowly. Very well, but I have conditions. The boldness of her statement almost made Marcus smile. Here was a woman who had lost everything, who was completely at his mercy, and she was trying to negotiate terms with one of the most feared warriors alive. It should have been amusing. Instead, it made his respect for her deepen even further. Name them, he said. The other captives must be your first priority. Whatever happens to me, they have to be saved first. Elena's voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed, despite her current circumstances. Marcus inclined. His head agreed. And when this is over, you let me go. No demands for ransom, no political games. I walk away free. This condition hit Marcus like a physical blow. The thought of letting her disappear from his life after just finding her felt wrong on a level he couldn't explain. But he forced himself to nod. If that's what you want. Elena seemed surprised by his easy agreement. Perhaps she had expected him to argue or demand something in return. Those are my terms. Then we have a bargain, Lady Elena. Marcus rose to his feet, his full height casting her in shadow. But I have one condition of my own. She tilted her head, waiting. You stay close to me until this is finished. These woods are full of dangers beyond those bandits, and I won't risk losing you to wolves or worse while I'm hunting the men who hurt you. Color bloomed in Elena's cheeks at his protective tone, and Marcus felt satisfaction at having affected her. Composure even slightly. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I accept your condition. Marcus turned to address his men, who had been maintaining a respectful distance while pretending not to listen to every word of the conversation. Ryan, gather the others. We're changing our mission. The grizzled veteran approached, his weathered face creased with concern. Chieftain, we're supposed to meet the rest of the hunting party at the northern ridge by sunset. If we don't show, they'll assume we're dead and return to the stronghold. Send 2 men back to explain the delay. Tell them we're pursuing raiders who attack travelers in our territory. Marcus's voice carried the absolute authority his men were accustomed to obeying without question. The rest of us have work to do. Ryan nodded, though Marcus could see the questions burning in the older man's eyes. In 15 years of following Marcus into battle, the veteran had never seen his chieftain show such personal interest in the fate of strangers. But he was too experienced a warrior to voice his concerns in front of the others. As the camp bustled with activity, Marcus found his attention drawn back to Elena. She sat quietly on the stone where he had left her, watching his men prepare for battle with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Despite her noble birth, she seemed comfortable around soldiers, as if she had spent time observing military preparations before. You've seen war, Marcus observed, settling beside her again. Elena glanced at him sideways. My kingdom has been at conflict with our neighbors for most of my life. I've spent considerable time in army camps and war councils. She paused, studying his face. though I've never met anyone quite like you. Meaning? Most warriors I've known were either brutal savages who took what they wanted, or honorable knights who talked endlessly about codes and glory. Elena's voice was thoughtful. You're something different. Dangerous, obviously, but not cruel. Powerful, but not arrogant. Marcus felt heat creep up his neck at her assessment. You don't know me well enough to make such judgments. Perhaps not, Elena agreed. But I'm usually good at reading people. It's a skill that's kept me alive in my father's court. She was quiet for a moment, then added softly, I think you're more than you pretend to be. Before Marcus could respond to that unsettling observation, Ryan returned with their preparations complete. We're ready, Chieftain. The trackers have found signs of a large group moving southwest toward the river valley. Marcus stood, automatically offering Elena his hand to help her rise. When she placed her small fingers in his palm, he felt that same electric jolt of connection that had caught him off guard earlier. Her skin was soft as silk, but he could feel calluses on her fingertips that spoke of weapon training. Another puzzle piece in the complex picture she presented. Can you ride? He asked, noting the way she favored her injured leg. I can manage, Elena replied, though Marcus could hear the uncertainty beneath her brave words. He studied her face, seeing the stubborn set of her jaw that suggested she would push herself to the point of collapse rather than admit weakness. It was an expression he recognized, having worn it himself countless times. But the thought of her in pain while trying to keep up with his warriors made his chest tighten. You'll ride with me, Marcus decided. My horse is trained for battle and can carry both of us easily. Elena opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Very well. Marcus led her to where his massive warhorse stood waiting. The animal was nearly as intimidating as its master, standing 18 hands high with the powerful build of a creature bred for carrying armored warriors into combat. Its dark coat gleamed like polished obsidian, and intelligent eyes watched their approach with alert interest. His name is Thunder, Marcus said, stroking the horse's neck with obvious affection. He's been my companion for 8 years. Elena approached the huge animal with appropriate caution. Thunder lowered his great head to sniff at her, and after a moment of consideration, allowed her to touch his nose. He's magnificent, she said, genuine admiration in her voice. He's saved my life more times than I can count, Marcus replied, swinging up into the saddle with practiced ease. He leaned down to offer Elena his hand. Trust him, and trust me. Elena looked up at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing her options. Finally, she grasped his outstretched hand and allowed him to lift her up behind him. The ease with which he pulled her into the saddle made her gasp softly, reminded once again of the raw strength contained in his massive frame. Hold on, Marcus instructed as she settled behind him on the broad saddle. When she hesitated, he reached back to guide her arms around his waist. I won't let you fall. The contact sent fire racing through Marcus's veins. Elena's body was warm against his back, her arms encircling him in a gesture that felt both innocent and intimate. He could smell the faint scent of wildflowers in her hair, could feel her heartbeat against his spine. It took all his considerable self-control to focus on the task ahead rather than the woman pressed against him. They rode out in formation, with Marcus and Elena in the center surrounded by his warriors. The men maintained their usual discipline, but Marcus could feel their curious glances. He had never allowed anyone to share his mount before, had never shown such obvious care for a stranger's comfort and safety. The forest path wound through towering pine trees and across babbling streams, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter. Elena proved to be an excellent rider despite her injuries, moving with Thunder's gait as if she had been born in the saddle. Her arms remained around Marcus's waist, and he found himself acutely aware of every small adjustment she made, every time her grip tightened when Thunder navigated rough terrain. Tell me about your home, Marcus said after they had been riding for an hour. partly to distract himself from her proximity, and partly because he genuinely wanted to know more about her. Elena was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and tinged with sadness. Raven's Hollow is beautiful. Rolling green hills, crystal clear lakes, orchards that bloom like snow in spring. The castle sits on a cliff overlooking the sea, and on clear days you can see ships from distant lands bringing goods from across the world. It sounds peaceful, Marcus observed. It was when I was young, Elena replied. Before the wars started, before my father became obsessed with expanding our territory. Before court became a place where every smile hid a knife and every friendship was a potential betrayal. Marcus heard the pain in her voice and felt an answering ache in his chest. Is that why you were traveling? To escape? Elena's arms tightened slightly around his waist. I was being sent to marry a lord from the Eastern Kingdoms. A political alliance my father arranged without consulting me. The marriage would have secured a trade agreement and a military pact. But you didn't want this marriage, Marcus guessed. Lord Aldrich is 3 times my age, known for his cruelty to his previous wives, and interested only in my bloodline and dowry. Elena's voice held a bitter edge. But my wants have never been a consideration in my father's plans. Marcus felt rage kindle in his chest again, this time directed at a man he had never met. The idea of Elena being forced into marriage with someone who would not cherish her properly made his hands clench on Thunder's reins. And now? Now I suppose I'm officially missing, presumed dead. Perhaps Aldrich will find another bride more to his liking. Elena's tone suggested she found this possibility far from tragic. Would you go back? Marcus asked. To your father's court? Elena was quiet for a long time before answering. I don't know. It's the only life I've ever known, but I'm not sure it's a life worth living anymore. Her honesty struck Marcus like a blow. Here was a woman who had lost everything, her escort, her belongings, possibly her life as she knew it, and yet she sounded more free than trapped. The realization that she might choose to disappear entirely rather than return to her old life sent a strange mix of hope and terror through his heart. They rode in companionable silence after that, the steady rhythm of Thunder's hooves and the warmth of Elena's body against his back lulling Marcus into an unusual state of peace. For a man who had spent most of his adult life in a state of constant alertness, the feeling was both foreign and deeply welcome. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees when Ryan signaled from ahead that they were approaching the area where the bandit trail led toward the river valley. Marcus raised his hand to halt the column, his senses immediately sharpening as they entered potentially hostile territory. We dismount here, he told Elena quietly. From now on, we move on foot. Elena nodded, understanding the need for stealth. Marcus swung down from the saddle first, then reached up to help her down. As his hands spanned her waist and he lifted her to the ground, he was struck again by how small and delicate she seemed compared to his massive frame. The protective instincts that had been growing stronger throughout the day flared into fierce determination. Stay close, he murmured, not releasing her waist immediately. And if I tell you to run, you run. No questions, no arguments. Elena looked up into his eyes, her expression serious. I understand. Marcus nodded, finally stepping back and turning his attention to his men. They had formed a defensive perimeter while he was distracted, their weapons ready and their eyes scanning the surrounding forest for threats. These were experienced warriors who had followed him through countless dangerous situations, and their calm professionalism was reassuring. Ryan, take 3 men and scout ahead. Find their camp but don't engage. We need to know numbers, positions, and where they're keeping the captives before we move. Marcus's voice carried the authority of absolute command. Signal when you have information. The veteran nodded and melted into the forest with his chosen companions. moving with the silent grace of men who had learned to hunt both animals and humans. Marcus turned to the remaining warriors, his expression grim. "The rest of you prepare for combat. Check your weapons, secure anything that might make noise. We go in fast and hard when the time comes, but we do this smart. Innocent lives depend on us getting this right." As his men carried out their preparations, Marcus found himself standing beside Elena, both of them looking toward the river valley where their enemies waited. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward them like grasping fingers. "Are you afraid?" Elena asked softly. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Of battle?" "No. I've been fighting since I was old enough to hold a weapon. Combat is familiar territory." He paused, then added with uncommon honesty, "But I'm afraid of failing you. Of not being able to save those women, or keep you safe in the process." Elena turned to look at him, surprise evident in her green eyes. "You've known me for less than a day. Why does my safety matter so much to you?" It was a fair question, one Marcus had been asking himself since the moment he first saw her by the stream. The answer that came to him was both simple and terrifying. In its implications, "Because you matter," he said quietly. "I can't explain it, can't rationalize it, but from the moment I saw you, everything changed. You've done something to me that 15 years of warfare couldn't accomplish." "What's that?" Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus met her eyes, his expression more vulnerable than she had yet seen it. "You've given me something worth fighting for beyond duty and honor. You've made me remember what it feels like to want to protect something precious." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. Elena's breath caught, her eyes searching his face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet forest and the approaching threat of violence, something fundamental shifted between them. Before either could say anything more, Ryan's signal came from ahead, a series of bird calls that meant he had found the bandit camp. Marcus immediately shifted back into warrior mode, his personal revelations pushed aside in favor of tactical thinking. "It's time," he said, checking his weapons one final time. "Stay behind me, stay quiet, and whatever happens, don't try to be a hero." Elena nodded, though Marcus could see the worry in her eyes. As they began moving through the forest toward whatever waited ahead, he found himself offering a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Not for victory in battle, that he was confident of achieving, but for the chance to keep the woman behind him safe, and perhaps for the wisdom to understand what she was coming to mean to him. The hunt was about to begin, and Marcus knew that. More than just bandits' lives hung in the balance. The course of his own future, and Elena's, would be decided in the next few hours. As they moved deeper into the shadows of the coming evening, he vowed that whatever the cost, he would not fail her. The river valley spread out below them like a natural amphitheater, its steep sides covered with dense undergrowth that provided excellent cover for approach. Ryan and his scouts had positioned themselves on the opposite ridge, and their signals indicated a camp of significant size in the valley floor near the water's edge. Marcus crouched behind a fallen log, Elena pressed close beside him and studied the scene below through the gathering dusk. Campfires flickered between the trees, and he could make out the shapes of men moving around the camp with the casual confidence of those who believed themselves safe from pursuit. 17 men, just as the lady said, Ryan reported in barely audible whisper as he rejoined their group. But they've got at least 6 captives in a cage wagon near the center of camp. All women, all alive as far as we could tell. Marcus nodded grimly. A direct assault would be risky with hostages in the middle of the enemy position, but stealth might allow them to free the captives before the main battle began. Guard positions? 2 sentries on the north approach, one watching the wagon, and the rest gathered around the main fire. They're drinking heavily and don't seem to expect trouble. Ryan's weathered face was grim in the fading light. They're confident, chieftain. Maybe too confident. Good. Overconfidence makes men careless. Marcus turned to Elena, his expression serious. This is where you stay. Hidden, safe, out of the fighting. Elena's jaw set in the stubborn expression he was beginning to recognize. Those women down there have been captives for 4 days. If there's any way I can help, you can help by staying alive, Marcus interrupted firmly. I can't fight effectively if I'm worried about your safety. For a moment, it looked like Elena might argue further. Then she seemed to see something in his eyes that convinced her. Very well. But promise me you'll be careful. The concern in her voice sent warmth flooding through Marcus's chest. When had anyone worried about his safety in battle? When had anyone's concern mattered to him so much? I promise. As darkness fell over the valley, Marcus and his warriors began their descent toward the bandit camp, moving like shadows among the trees. Behind them, hidden in a natural depression near the ridge top, Elena waited and prayed that the giant warrior who had turned her world upside down would return to her safely. The real test was about to begin. The descent into the valley felt like entering the mouth of a sleeping beast. Marcus moved through the undergrowth with practiced silence, his massive frame somehow gliding between branches and over fallen logs, without disturbing so much as a leaf. Behind him, his warriors followed in perfect formation, each man a shadow among shadows, their weapons gleaming dully in the pale moonlight that filtered through the canopy above. Every step down the hillside brought them closer to the flickering campfires below, and with each footfall, Marcus felt the familiar transformation taking place within him. The gentle giant who had tended Elena's wounds was being replaced by something far more dangerous, something that had earned him his fearsome reputation across the northern territories. Yet even as the battle fury began to build in his veins, part of his mind remained focused on the woman hidden safely above them, waiting for his return. The first sentry never knew what hit him. Ryan emerged from the darkness like death itself, his blade finding the man's throat before a single sound could escape. The body dropped silently into the ferns, and Ryan melted back into the forest as if he had never been there at all. Marcus felt a grim satisfaction at the clean kill. His men were the best because he had trained them to be, and tonight their skills would serve a purpose beyond mere survival or conquest. The second sentry proved more alert, his head turning at some slight sound, just as Marcus's warrior Thomas approached from behind. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended as the bandit's mouth opened to shout a warning. Then Marcus's throwing knife took him in the chest, the impact driving him backward into the trees with only a soft grunt of expelled air. Thomas caught the falling body and lowered it gently to the ground, his eyes meeting Marcus's across the distance with professional acknowledgement. 2 down, 15 to go. But now came the difficult part. The cage wagon sat in the center of the camp like an iron monument to human cruelty. Even from his concealed position 50 yards away, Marcus could see the huddled forms of the captive. Women pressed together for warmth and comfort within the barred enclosure. One guard sat on a stump nearby, his attention divided between the prisoners and a bottle of stolen wine. The rest of the bandits were gathered around a large fire on the far side of camp, their raucous laughter carrying clearly through the night air. Marcus studied the layout with the calculating eye of a seasoned tactician. The wagon's position was both blessing and curse. It was isolated enough that they might free the captives without immediately alerting the main group, but it was also positioned so that any fighting around it would quickly draw attention from the entire camp. Speed would be essential. He caught Ryan's eye and gestured toward the lone guard. The veteran nodded and began working his way around the camp's perimeter, moving with the patience of a hunter who understood that haste led to carelessness. Marcus waited, counting his own heartbeats, forcing himself to remain still despite every instinct screaming at him to charge forward and end as quickly. The guard took another long pull from his bottle, his head tilting back as he savored the stolen wine. It was the last thing he would ever taste. Ryan's blade slid between his ribs with surgical precision, finding the heart before the man could even gasp. Ryan lowered the body carefully to avoid any noise, then immediately turned his attention to the wagon's lock. Marcus began moving forward, his warhammer held ready across his back. Each step was calculated, each movement designed to bring him closer to the main group of bandits, without alerting them to his presence. His other warriors spread out in a wide circle, surrounding the camp like wolves preparing to close on their prey. The lock on the cage gave way with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Ryan eased the door open and whispered urgently to the captive women. Inside, Marcus could see them stirring, hope and fear warring in their faces as they realized rescue might finally be at hand. But he also saw the challenge they represented. 6 traumatized women who would need to be moved to safety before the real fighting could begin. One of the bandits around the main fire stood up, stretching and yawning as he prepared to relieve himself in the bushes. His path would take him directly past the wagon, and there was no way to avoid being seen. Marcus felt time compressing around him like a tightening noose. In seconds, their stealth approach would be blown and chaos would reign. But sometimes chaos was exactly what a situation needed. Marcus stepped from the shadows into the firelight, his enormous frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow half the camp. The bandit who had been walking toward the bushes stopped so suddenly he nearly fell over backward, his wine-dulled mind struggling to process what he was seeing. For a moment, the entire camp fell silent except for the crackling of flames and the soft sound of the river flowing nearby. Then the screaming started. Ghost! The first bandit shrieked, pointing at Marcus with a trembling hand. It's a giant! A demon! The camp erupted into panicked motion. Men scrambled for weapons that had been carelessly set aside, stumbling over each other in their haste to respond to this supernatural threat that had materialized from the darkness. But their fear worked against them, making them clumsy and disorganized just when they needed coordination most. Marcus smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I am Marcus of the Stone Wolf tribe, he announced, his voice carrying easily over the chaos. You have taken what does not belong to you, harmed those under my protection. For this, you will answer. The bandit leader, a scarred man with dead eyes and hands stained with old blood, pushed through his panicking men. Unlike the others, he showed no fear at Marcus's supernatural appearance, only the cold calculation of a professional killer sizing up a threat. Stone Wolf, the leader spat, his hand moving to the curved sword at his belt. Heard tell you were just stories to frighten children. Guess we'll find out. You will, Marcus agreed, and drew his warhammer. The weapon seemed to come alive. In his hands, its massive head gleaming with reflected firelight. The hammer had been forged in the sacred fires of his tribe, its steel folded 1,000 times and quenched in the blood of his enemies. It had never failed him in 15 years of warfare, and tonight would be no different. The leader came at him with impressive speed, his blade whistling through the air in a series of precise cuts designed to find gaps in armor. But Marcus wore no armor tonight, relying instead on speed and the reach advantage his massive weapon provided. He let the first strike pass harmlessly by, then brought his hammer around in a devastating arc. The bandit leader managed to get his sword up in time to block, but the impact drove him to his knees and sent vibrations through his bones that left his hands numb. His eyes widened as he realized the impossible strength he was facing, but then it was too late to reconsider his choice of opponents. Marcus's second strike caved in the man's skull like an eggshell. Around the camp, his warriors struck with coordinated precision. These bandits might have military training, but they were drunk, disorganized, and facing men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of killing. The outcome was never really in doubt. A bandit with a crossbow tried to target Marcus from across the fire, but Thomas's thrown axe took him down before he could loose his bolt. Another attempted to circle around and attack from behind, only to find Ryan waiting with a spear that punched through his chest and emerged from his back in a shower of blood. Marcus waded through the chaos like a force of nature, his hammer rising and falling with mechanical precision. Each swing claimed a life. Each step forward drove the survivors further into panic. He had become what his enemies whispered about in their darkest nightmares, death incarnate wrapped in human flesh. But even as he fought, part of his mind remained focused on the cage wagon and the women Ryan was helping to escape. Every few seconds, his eyes would flick toward them, ensuring their safety even as he carved a path of destruction through their captors. The protection of innocence had always been central to his warrior code, but tonight it felt different, more personal. A bandit with a morning star managed to get close enough to swing at Marcus's head, the spiked ball whistling through the air with deadly intent. Marcus caught the weapon's handle just below the head, his grip stopping its momentum as if it had struck a mountain. The bandit's eyes went wide with disbelief before Marcus's other hand closed around his throat and lifted him from the ground. "You chose poorly," Marcus growled, then hurled the man into the campfire with enough force to scatter burning logs across the clearing. The fight was over in less than 5 minutes. 17 bandits lay dead or dying among the ruins of their camp, their stolen wealth scattered like meaningless trinkets across ground soaked with blood. Marcus stood in the center of the carnage, his hammer dripping red, his chest heaving with the aftermath of battle fury. But as the rage faded, he felt no satisfaction in the victory. These men had been evil, certainly, deserving of death for their crimes. Yet killing them brought him no joy, only a hollow sense of completion. The fire that had once burned bright within him during combat now felt more like duty than passion. "Chieftain," Ryan called softly from beside the wagon. "The women are safe," shaken, but unharmed beyond what they suffered before. Marcus nodded, wiping his hammer clean on a dead bandit's cloak before securing it across his back. He approached the group of rescued women, noting how they shrank back from his blood-covered form, despite knowing he was their savior. It was a reaction he had grown accustomed to over the years, but tonight it stung more than usual. "You're safe now," he told them, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. "My men will escort you to the nearest town, ensure you reach your families." The oldest of the women, a middle-aged merchant's wife with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes, stepped forward despite her obvious fear. "Thank you," she said simply. "We had given up hope." "Hope should never be abandoned while good people still draw breath," Marcus replied. It was something his father had told him once, long ago, and the words felt appropriate now. As his warriors began the process of organizing the women for travel and gathering what remained of their stolen possessions, Marcus found himself drawn back toward the path that led up the valley wall. Elena was waiting for him up there, probably worried sick despite his promise to return safely. The thought of seeing her again, of looking into those green eyes and finding approval rather than fear, filled him with an anticipation that had nothing to do with warrior's pride or the satisfaction of completed duty. For the first time in years, he was eager to set aside his weapons and simply be a man in the presence of a woman who saw something in him beyond his capacity for violence. "Ryan," he called to his second in command, "take the others and begin the escort duty. I'll catch up shortly." The veteran's weathered face creased with concern. "Chieftain, you shouldn't travel alone. There could be other bandits in these woods." "I won't be alone," Marcus replied, then caught the knowing look that passed over Ryan's features. His relationship with Elena might be new and undefined, but it apparently wasn't as subtle as he had hoped. The climb back up the valley wall felt different than the descent had. Where before he had moved with predatory purpose, now Marcus found himself almost eager, his steps quick despite the steep terrain. The battle fury had completely faded, leaving behind something warmer and more human then the cold satisfaction of victory. Elena was exactly where he had left her, curled in the natural depression with her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. But she wasn't sleeping. Instead, she sat watching the path he would take on his return, her green eyes reflecting the moonlight like jewels. When she saw him emerging from the shadows, relief transformed her features into something radiant. "Marcus," she breathed, rising quickly to meet him. "Thank the gods you're safe." The genuine concern in her voice hit him harder than any enemy weapon ever had. Without thinking, he opened his arms and she flew into them, her small form fitting against his massive chest as if she had been made to rest there. For a moment, they simply held each other in the moonlight, two souls finding comfort in contact after the terror and violence of the night. "The women?" Elena asked, pulling back just enough to look up into his face. "Safe, all of them. Ryan is escorting them to the nearest settlement even now." Marcus found himself studying every detail of her expression, memorizing the way relief and gratitude played across her features. "And the bandits?" "Dead, all of them." Marcus waited for the revulsion he usually saw when people were reminded of his capacity for killing. Instead, Elena simply nodded as if she had expected no other outcome. "Good," she said firmly. "They deserved whatever they received for what they did to those women, to me." Her acceptance of his violent nature should have pleased him, but instead it raised uncomfortable questions about what kind of man he had become. "Does it not bother you, knowing what I'm capable of?" Elena studied his face in the pale light, her expression thoughtful. "Should it? You didn't kill those men for pleasure or profit. You killed them because they were evil and needed to be stopped. There's a difference between necessary violence and cruelty, Marcus. I've seen enough of both to know which category you fall into." Her words settled something restless in his chest, some part of him that had been questioning his own nature. Since the moment he first looked into her eyes, here was a woman who could see past the blood and reputation to something deeper, something worth caring about. "What happens now?" Elena asked softly. It was a question that had been haunting Marcus since the battle ended. What did happen now? His duty was complete. The bandits were dead and the captives were safe. By all rights, he should escort Elena to the nearest town, ensure her safety, and return to his tribe. It was what honor demanded, what wisdom suggested. But the thought of walking away from her felt like tearing out his own heart. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want to happen." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if looking for answers to questions she hadn't yet voiced. When she finally spoke, her words were barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go back to my old life. The marriage my father arranged, the political gains, the constant feeling that I'm nothing more than a pawn to be traded for advantage." She paused, then added with growing conviction, "I want to choose my own path for once." "And what path would you choose?" Marcus asked, though he hardly dared hope for the answer his heart desired. Elena reached up to touch his face, her small hand warm against his bearded cheek. "I think I'd like to learn more about the man who risks everything to save strangers, who commands absolute loyalty from his warriors, yet treats a nobody like me as if I were precious beyond measure." Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. "You're not a nobody, Elena. You're everything." The words came out more intensely than he had intended, carrying all the emotion he had been struggling to contain since first laying eyes on her. Elena's face went still, her green eyes wide with surprise at the raw honesty in his voice. "Marcus," she began, but he pressed on before he could lose his nerve. "I know it's madness. I know we've only known each other for a day. Know that you're nobility, and I'm a warrior whose hands are stained with blood. But something about you has changed me, Elena, made me want things I never thought I'd want, feel things I didn't know I was capable of feeling." Elena's hand was trembling against his cheek now, her breathing quick and shallow. "What kinds of things?" "Peace," Marcus said simply. A home that's more than just a fortress. Someone to fight for instead of just fighting because it's what I'm good at. He paused, gathering courage for the most important words he had ever spoken. Someone to love who might, possibly, love me in return. The silence that followed felt endless. Marcus waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, wondering if he had just destroyed whatever fragile connection had been building between them. He had laid his soul bare before this woman, admitted feelings that made him more vulnerable than any enemy had ever managed. Then Alina smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "You really don't understand, do you?" She said softly. "The effect you have on people, on me specifically?" Marcus shook his head, genuinely confused. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by men who saw me as either a political asset or a beautiful object to be possessed. Lords and princes who spoke poetry about my eyes, but never bothered to ask what I thought about anything important. Warriors who boasted of their strength, but trembled at the slightest challenge to their pride." Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued, her hand still warm against his face. "Then you appear out of nowhere, this giant of a man with a reputation that should terrify me, and what do? You tend my wounds with hands gentler than any healer. You risk your life to save women you've never met because it's the right thing to do. You ask for nothing from me except the chance to keep me safe." She paused, her thumb tracing across his cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "Do you know what it feels like to finally meet someone who sees you as a person worth protecting rather than a prize worth claiming? Someone whose strength makes you feel safe instead of trapped?" Marcus felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen, hope blooming like spring flowers after a harsh winter. "Elena, I love you too, you impossible man," she whispered, then rose on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deeper as Marcus's arms came around her and pulled her closer. She tasted like hope and courage, and everything good he had thought was lost to him forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. "What are we going to do?" Elena asked, her voice slightly breathless. Marcus looked down at this extraordinary woman who had somehow seen past his fearsome exterior to find something worth loving. The future spread out before them, uncertain and challenging, but suddenly full of possibilities he had never dared consider. "Whatever we want," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Whatever makes us happy." Elena laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to light up the entire forest. "I've never been asked what would make me happy before." "Then we'll start there," Marcus promised, sealing the vow with another kiss that tasted like the beginning of everything. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, silent witnesses to the transformation of a giant warrior who had finally found someone worthy of surrendering to. The battle was won, but the real victory was just beginning. The dawn mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Marcus and Elena made their way back toward his tribal lands. 3 days had passed since their declaration of love beneath the stars. 3 days of traveling together through forests that seemed somehow brighter now, as if the world itself had been transformed by what had grown between them. Yet with each mile they covered, Marcus felt a growing weight in his chest, a knowledge that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. Elena rode behind him on Thunder, her arms wrapped around his waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. But Marcus could sense the tension building in her small frame, could feel the way her grip tightened whenever they crested a hill that offered a view of the mountains ahead. She knew, as he did, that they were approaching the moment when their private happiness would collide with the harsh realities of the world they lived in. The stone vault stronghold perched on a rocky outcrop like an eagle's nest, its massive walls carved from the living stone of the mountain itself. From a distance, it looked impregnable, eternal, a fortress that had stood against countless enemies and would continue standing long after all who lived there had returned to dust. As they drew closer, Marcus could see the familiar banners snapping in the wind, could make out the tiny figures of sentries walking the battlements. Home, the word should have filled him with satisfaction, with the pleasure of return after successful mission completion. Instead, all he felt was dread. "It's magnificent," Alina said softly, her voice carrying a note of awe as she took in the massive structure before them. "I've seen many castles, but nothing quite like this. My grandfather carved it from the raw stone with his own hands," Marcus replied, pride and apprehension warring in his voice. "3 generations of my family have ruled from those walls, protected our people within them. And now you're bringing home something they'll never expect," Alina observed, her insight cutting straight to the heart of his fears. Marcus nodded grimly. The Stone Wolf tribe had ancient traditions, rigid codes of honor and behavior that governed every aspect of their lives. Marriage was a political tool, a way to cement alliances between tribes and ensure the continuation of bloodlines. Love, especially love that crossed cultural boundaries, was seen as weakness, a distraction that could compromise a leader's judgment. And here he was, their chieftain, their war leader, returning home with a foreign woman who had somehow managed to bring him to his knees without striking a single blow. The gates of the stronghold swung open as they approached, massive iron-bound. Oak panels that had never yielded to any enemy. The sound echoed off the stone walls like thunder, announcing their arrival to everyone within. Marcus could see his people gathering in the courtyard, warriors and crafters and elders all drawn by curiosity about their leader's unexpected return. As thunder's hooves rang against the stone pavement of the courtyard, Marcus felt every eye upon them. The weight of hundreds of gazes pressed down like a physical force, and he could hear the whispers starting even before he had dismounted. His people had never seen him show such obvious care for anyone, had never watched him help someone down from his horse with such gentle consideration. Elena's feet touched the ground, and she immediately straightened, transforming from the woman who had clung to him in private moments into the noble lady she had been born to be. Her spine was straight, her chin lifted, her green eyes calm despite what Marcus knew must be tremendous nervousness. She faced the assembled crowd with a dignity that would have done credit to any royal court. "Marcus!" The voice that cut through the whispers belonged to Elder Grimwald, the oldest member of the tribal council and a man who had known Marcus since birth. His weathered face was carved into lines of disapproval as he approached, his staff tapping against the stones with each step. "You return later than expected and with unexpected company." Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the barely concealed criticism in the old man's tone. "I return when my duty was complete, Elder, as I always have." "And what duty required you to bring a foreign woman into our stronghold?" Grimwald's eyes fixed on Elena with obvious suspicion. "She bears no tribal markings, speaks no words of greeting in our tongue. What is her purpose here?" The challenge was direct, unavoidable, exactly what Marcus had been dreading. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, eager to hear how their chieftain would respond to such a public questioning of his judgment. He could see Ryan standing near the armory, his second-in-command's face carefully neutral, but his eyes concerned. Marcus drew himself up to his full height, every inch the war leader who had never been successfully challenged. "Her purpose is whatever I say it is, Elder. She is under my protection, and that should be sufficient explanation for anyone." "Protection?" Grimwald's voice rose with incredulity. "Since when do we offer protection to random strangers? Since when do you risk tribal resources for the sake of foreign nobility?" The accusation hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, the familiar fire that had carried him through countless battles. But before he could respond, Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Since your chieftain chose to honor the ancient codes of hospitality and protection that separates civilized people from barbarians," she said, her words pitched to carry authority despite her small stature, since he proved that the Stone Wolf tribe produces leaders worthy of the respect they command. The crowd stirred at her boldness, surprised by both her fluency in their language and her willingness to speak in their sacred space. Grimwald's eyes narrowed dangerously, clearly unused to being addressed so directly by an outsider. "You speak our tongue well for a stranger," the elder said, his tone still hostile, but now tinged with grudging respect. "But words are easily learned. Loyalty, honor, understanding of our ways, these are not so simple to acquire." "You're right," Elena agreed, surprising everyone including Marcus. "I am a stranger here, ignorant of your customs and traditions. But I know quality when I see it, and I know strength that comes from honor rather than fear. Your chieftain embodies both." Marcus felt his heart swell with pride at her words, but also with growing concern about where this confrontation was heading. The tribal council would expect explanations, justifications for his actions that went beyond simple attraction or even love. They would want to know how Elena fit into their world, what benefit her presence brought to their people. "The council will convene at sunset," Grimwald announced, his decision clearly final. "This matter requires formal discussion and resolution." As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus felt Elena's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. The simple gesture of support meant more to him than any victory on any battlefield ever had. Together, they walked toward the great hall, aware of every whisper that followed in their wake. The great hall of the Stone Wolf stronghold was a monument to their martial heritage. Weapons from 100 battles lined the walls. Banners of defeated enemies hung like trophies from the rafters, and the massive table at the center was carved from a single piece of ironwood that had taken 20 men to move into place. This was where the tribe's most important decisions were made, where matters of war and peace were debated by the Council of Elders. Tonight, Marcus stood before that table as he had countless times before, but everything felt different. Instead of reporting on successful raids or planning defensive strategies, he was fighting for the right to choose his own happiness. The irony was not lost on him that the man who could command absolute obedience on the battlefield found himself powerless in matters of the heart. Elena sat in the gallery reserved for observers, her presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. She had changed into a simple dress borrowed from one of the tribal women, her noble finery replaced by practical wool and leather. Yet even in common clothing, she radiated a dignity that seemed to fill the entire hall. The 5 members of the tribal council sat in their traditional positions, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps and the central fire pit. Besides Grimwald, there was Marta the wise woman, keeper of tribal lore and traditions. Thorvald the weapons master, responsible for training the warriors. Bronson the trade speaker, who handled negotiations with other tribes. And finally, Eric, the newest member of the council, and the only one who might be sympathetic to Marcus's situation. "Chieftain Marcus," Grimwald began formally, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You stand before this council to explain actions that some consider contrary to tribal interest and tradition. Speak and let your words be heard." Marcus had faced armies without flinching, had stared death in the face more times than he could count. But standing before these 5 people who had known him all his life, defending feelings he barely understood himself, required a different kind of courage entirely. "Honored elders," he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I stand before you as I always have, as your chieftain and war leader, a man who has never placed personal desire above tribal welfare. What I ask of you now is trust in my judgment, as you have trusted it in all matters of war and peace." "Pretty words," Grimwald replied dryly. "But you ask us to trust a judgment that appears clouded by attraction to a foreign woman. How can you claim to put tribal welfare first when you bring potential danger into our very stronghold?" "What danger?" Marcus demanded, his patience beginning to fray. She is one woman, alone, seeking nothing from us but sanctuary. Where is the threat? In that? Marta the wise woman leaned forward, her ancient eyes sharp as polished steel. The danger, young chief, lies not in her blade or her army, but in what she represents. You care for this woman, yes? Care deeply enough to risk your standing with your own people? Marcus felt the trap closing around him, but there was no escape except through honesty. I do. And if enemies of our tribe learned of this attachment, if they threatened her to control you, or used her as bait to draw you into foolish action. Marta's questions were relentless, cutting to the heart of every fear Marcus had tried to suppress. How then would you balance your duty to her against your duty to us? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Elena's eyes upon him from the gallery above. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, hung in the balance of his next words. You ask me to choose between love and duty, Marcus said. Finally, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press against the very stones of the hall. But you assume they must be in conflict. What if they are not? Thorvald the weapons master snorted dismissively. Love makes warriors weak, boy. Makes them hesitate when they should strike. Makes them value individual lives over necessary victory. You know this. Do I? Marcus turned to face the man who had taught him to fight, the grizzled veteran who had shaped him into the warrior he had become. Because what I know is that love has made me stronger, not weaker. It has given me something worth fighting for beyond mere duty or tradition. He began to pace before the council table, his words gaining strength as he spoke. For 15 years, I have led you in battle because it was expected of me, because it was what I was trained to do. I was good at it, successful, but it was empty. A hollow exercise in violence that brought victory but no joy. Marcus stopped, his eyes finding Elena in the gallery above. Then I met a woman who saw past the reputation and the fear to find something worth caring about. A woman who made me remember that strength without purpose is meaningless, that victory without something precious to protect is just another form of defeat. Beautiful sentiment, Grimwold said, his tone suggesting anything but appreciation. But sentiment does not win wars or protect our people from those who would destroy us. How does your happiness serve the tribe? Marcus felt the moment crystallizing around him, the crossroads where his future would be decided. He could take the safe path, send Elena away, and return to his old life of empty duty and hollow victories. Or he could fight for something better. Something that might transform not just his own existence, but the entire nature of what it meant to lead. Because a leader who has something worth living for fights harder than one who merely fears dying. Marcus said, his voice ringing with conviction. Because a chieftain who understands love can better protect the love his people have for their families, their homes, their way of life. He turned to address the entire council, his massive frame seeming to fill the hall with its presence. You worry that love will make me weak, but I tell you it has made me more dangerous than I have ever been. Because now I do not fight just to win, I fight to preserve. Not just to defeat enemies, but to protect something precious. Eric the Young spoke for the first time, his voice thoughtful. And if this woman is killed in battle? If your love becomes a source of grief that clouds your judgment in future conflicts? Marcus felt Elena's eyes upon him, knew she was waiting to hear how he would answer. The question cut to the heart of every warrior's deepest fear, the knowledge that anything precious could be lost in an instant. Then I will grieve, Marcus said simply. As any man grieves when he loses something he cherishes. But I will not become less for having loved, even if that love ends in sorrow. Better to have fought for something meaningful and lost it than to have spent my life fighting for nothing at all. The hall fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over the assembled council like a shroud. Marcus could see them wrestling with concepts that challenged everything they had been taught about leadership and strength. about the proper relationship between personal desire and tribal duty. Bronson, the trade speaker, finally broke the silence. "What do you propose, chieftain? That we simply accept this foreign woman as one of our own? That we ignore the potential complications her presence might bring?" "I propose that we judge her by her actions, not her origins," Marcus replied. "That we give her the same chance to prove herself that we would give any potential member of our tribe." "And if she fails these tests?" Marta asked pointedly. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Then she leaves, and I accept the consequences of my misjudgment." "And if she succeeds?" Grimwald's question carried dangerous implications, suggesting possibilities that Marcus had barely dared to hope for. "Then she becomes what she chooses to become: craftswoman, healer, warrior, wife." Marcus's voice caught slightly on the last word, but he pushed forward. "Whatever role she proves capable of filling." The council exchanged glances, silent communications passing between them that Marcus could not interpret. Finally, Grimwald rose from his chair, his ancient frame seeming to carry the weight of tradition itself. "The council will deliberate," he announced formally. "You will have our decision by dawn." As the elders filed out of the hall, Marcus felt exhaustion crash over him like a wave. He had fought the most important battle of his life, using only words as weapons, and he had no idea whether he had emerged victorious or defeated. Above him, Elena rose from her seat in the gallery, her face pale but determined. They met at the bottom of the stairs, and without a word, she moved into his arms. For a moment, they simply held each other in the empty hall, surrounded by the ghosts of ancient decisions and the weight of uncertain futures. "Whatever they decide," Elena whispered against his chest, "you fought for us. That matters more than any council ruling ever could." Marcus tightened his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her hair and trying to memorize the feeling of her body against his. "I may have just destroyed everything I've built for the sake of something I've known for less than a week. Then we'll build something new," Elena said with quiet conviction. "Something better." They spent the night walking the battlements of the stronghold, watching the stars wheel overhead and talking about futures that might never come to pass. Marcus showed her the places where he had played as a child, the training grounds where he had learned to fight, the shrine where his ancestors were honored. With each shared memory, each revealed piece of his history, the bond between them grew stronger. As dawn approached, they found themselves standing on the highest tower of the stronghold, looking out over the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the tribal lands. Somewhere out there lay Elena's former life, the political marriage she had fled, the father who would be searching for her. Somewhere else lay possibilities neither of them had yet dared to name. "No matter what happens," Marcus said as the first rays of sunlight painted the mountains gold, "I want you to know that meeting you changed everything for me. Made me remember what it feels like to be human instead of just a weapon pointed at the world." Elena turned in his arms, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "You saved me, Marcus. Not just from those bandits, but from a life where I was nothing more than a beautiful object to be traded for political advantage. You made me feel like a person worth protecting, worth cherishing." The sound of footsteps on the stone stairs interrupted their moment, announcing the arrival of a messenger. A young warrior Marcus recognized as one of Grimwald's grandsons climbed the last few steps, his face carefully neutral. "Chieftain," the young man said formally, "the council requests your presence in the great hall. Both of you." Marcus felt his heart begin to pound as they made their way back down through the stronghold. Whatever decision the council had reached would determine not just his own future, but Elena's as well. The woman walking beside him had risked everything by placing her trust in him, and now he could only hope that trust had not been misplaced. The great hall looked different in the morning light, less imposing but somehow more solemn. The 5 members of the council sat in their positions around the ironwood table, their faces revealing nothing of the night's deliberations. Marcus and Alina took their places before the table, standing close enough to touch but maintaining the formal distance the situation required. Grimwold rose slowly, his ancient bones creaking audibly in the morning stillness. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of final judgment. "Chieftain Marcus," he began, his eyes fixed on Marcus's face. "This council has debated long into the night about matters that touch the very heart of our tribal law and tradition. We have considered the implications of your request, the precedents it might set, the dangers it might invite." Marcus felt Elena's hand brush against his, a fleeting touch of comfort and solidarity. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "We have reached a decision," Grimwold continued, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "But first, we would hear from the woman herself. Lady Elena of Ravenshollow, approach and speak." Elena stepped forward, her spine straight and her chin lifted. Despite wearing borrowed clothes and standing in a hall full of people who could determine her fate with a word, she radiated the dignity of queens. "Honored elders," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I stand before you as a stranger seeking not just sanctuary, but acceptance. I know I have no right to claim either. Know that my presence here challenges your traditions in ways that make you uncomfortable." She paused, her eyes meeting each council member's gaze in turn. "But I also know that traditions that cannot bend will eventually break. I offer you not disruption, but growth. Not weakness, but a different kind of strength." "What strength do you speak of?" Marta the wise woman asked, her ancient voice sharp with curiosity. "The strength that comes from choice rather than obligation," Elena replied without hesitation. "The strength that comes from diversity rather than isolation. The strength that comes from love freely given rather than duty blindly followed." Thorvald leaned forward, his scarred face skeptical. "Pretty words, but what can you actually do? What skills do you bring to our people?" Elena smiled, and Marcus felt his heart skip at the confidence in her expression. "I can read and write in 7 languages. I have studied medicine and can treat wounds that would cripple your warriors. I understand trade negotiations and political alliances. I have been trained in diplomacy and can help you navigate relationships with neighboring tribes." She paused, then added with quiet dignity, "And I can love your chieftain in a way that makes him stronger, not weaker. More focused, not less. More human, not less of a leader." The hall fell silent as the council absorbed her words. Marcus felt pride swelling in his chest at her courage, at the way she had transformed what could have been a plea for mercy into a presentation of her qualifications. Finally, Grimwold nodded slowly. "The council has decided," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Lady Elena of Ravenshollow will be granted provisional membership in the Stone Wolf tribe." Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief, but Grimwold was not finished. "She will undergo the traditional trials that all potential members must face. Combat skills, survival knowledge, understanding of our laws and customs. She will be given 6 months to prove herself worthy of full acceptance." The elder's eyes fixed on Marcus with laser intensity. "And if she fails any of these trials, both she and the chieftain who vouched for her will face the consequences of that failure." Marcus nodded, understanding the risks being laid out. The council was giving them a chance, but it came with conditions that could destroy them, both if Alana could not adapt to tribal life. "Do you accept these terms?" Grimwold asked, directing the question to both of them. "I do," Elena said immediately, her voice steady with determination. "I do," Marcus echoed, his own voice rough with emotion. "Then let it be recorded," Grimwold announced formally. "Lady Elena of Ravenshollow is hereby granted provisional membership in the Stone Wolf tribe, subject to successful completion of all required trials." As the council members began to file out of the hall, Marcus felt Elena's hand slip into his. They had won the first battle, earned the right to fight for their future together. But both of them knew that the real challenges were just beginning. The tests that lay ahead would determine not just whether Elena could find a place among his people, but whether their love was strong enough to survive the trials that threatened to tear them apart. 6 months. The time had passed like water through Marcus's fingers, each day bringing new challenges that tested not just Elena's abilities, but the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about strength and leadership. Now, as he stood on the training grounds watching her face the final trial, Marcus realized that somewhere along the way, the question had stopped being whether Elena could prove herself worthy of his tribe, and had become whether his tribe could prove itself worthy of her. The combat trial was the last and most dangerous of the tests Elena had to pass. She had already demonstrated her medical knowledge by successfully treating injuries that had baffled the tribal healers. Her diplomatic skills had resolved a brewing conflict with a neighboring clan that could have led to war. She had learned their language so thoroughly that she could recite their ancient songs from memory, and her understanding of tribal law had impressed even the most skeptical elders. But combat was different. Combat was the heart of Stone Wolf culture, the skill that separated warriors from mere survivors. And here, facing Bjorn the Red in ritual combat, Elena would either earn her place among them forever or lose everything. She had work to build. Marcus watched from the circle of onlookers as Elena moved across the sandy arena, her borrowed sword catching the afternoon sunlight. 6 months of intensive training had transformed her soft, noble hands into calloused warriors' grips, had turned her graceful court dancing into deadly combat footwork. She was no longer the frightened woman he had found by the stream, though she would always be the woman who had changed his world. Bjorn the Red was not an enemy, exactly, but he was no friend either. A veteran warrior in his 30s with scars from a dozen battles and a reputation for never holding back, even in training. The tribal council had chosen him specifically because he would test Elena's skills without the emotional complications that might arise from facing someone who had grown to care for her over the past months. The two combatants circled each other like hunting cats, their weapons held in ready positions. Elena's sword was lighter than Bjorn's massive blade, a weapon chosen to complement her speed and agility rather than trying to match his raw strength. She had spent countless hours learning to use those advantages, turning what others saw as weakness into a different kind of power. Bjorn attacked first, his blade sweeping in a massive overhead strike that would have split Elena in half if it had connected. But she was no longer there, having flowed to the side like water around stone. Her counterstrike caught him across the ribs, not deep enough to cause serious injury, but hard enough to draw first blood. The crowd murmured appreciatively. First blood was always significant in ritual combat, but for Elena to draw it against a warrior of Bjorn's caliber was genuinely impressive. Marcus felt pride swelling in his chest, but also fear. He knew Bjorn would not make the same mistake twice. The red-haired warrior's expression shifted from casual confidence to serious concentration. His next attack was a series of rapid thrusts and cuts, each one designed to test a different aspect of Elena's defensive skills. She managed to parry most of them, but Marcus could see the strain starting to show in her movements, could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool autumn air. Then Bjorn's blade slipped past her guard, the tip scoring a line across her left shoulder. Blood welled up through the torn fabric of her training shirt, and Marcus had to physically restrain himself from entering the circle to check on her welfare. This was her trial, her moment to prove herself, and any interference from him would invalidate everything she had accomplished. Elena stepped back, assessing the wound with the clinical eye she had developed during her medical training. The cut was painful but not debilitating, shallow enough that it would not significantly hamper her movement. She adjusted her grip on her sword and resumed her ready stance, her green eyes now blazing with a determination that reminded Marcus why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. The remainder of the combat was a display of skill and courage that would be talked about in the tribal halls for years to come. Elena could not match Bjorn's strength or reach, but she fought with an intelligence and adaptability that gradually turned the tide in her favor. She used his aggression against him, let his powerful strikes carry him off balance, while she struck at exposed targets. By the time Grimwald called an end to the trial, both combatants were bloody and exhausted, but Elena had clearly proven herself capable of holding her own against a seasoned warrior. More importantly, she had shown the kind of heart that could not be taught, the willingness to endure pain and keep fighting for something that mattered. As the circle of spectators began to disperse, Marcus finally allowed himself to approach Elena. She was sitting on a wooden bench while Marta the wise woman tended to her wounds, her face pale but her eyes bright with triumph. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked, settling beside her on the bench despite the disapproving look Marta shot in his direction. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of mountain goats," Elena replied with a tired laugh. "But also like I've finally earned the right to be here." Marcus reached out to brush a strand of sweat-dampened hair from her forehead, his touch gentle despite his massive hands. "You earned that right the moment you chose to stay and fight for it. The council will announce their final decision at sunset," Marta interrupted, her ancient voice carrying both approval and warning. "Until then, both of you should rest and prepare yourselves for whatever comes next." As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus and Elena made their way to the great hall for the final time. The massive chamber was filled with the entire tribe, warriors and crafters, and children all gathered to witness the conclusion of a process that had captivated their attention for months. The 5 members of the tribal council sat in their traditional positions, their faces revealing nothing of the deliberations that had occupied them since the combat trial ended. Marcus felt Elena's hand slip into his as they took their places before the ironwood table, and he squeezed her fingers gently in a gesture of support and solidarity. Grimwald rose slowly, his ancient frame seeming to carry the weight of centuries of tribal tradition. When he spoke, his voice filled the hall with absolute authority. "Lady Elena of Ravenshollow," he began, his eyes fixed on her face. "6 months ago, you came before this council as a stranger seeking acceptance among our people. Tonight, you stand before us having completed every trial we set before you, having proven your worth in ways that command respect." The hall fell silent except for the crackling of the central fire and the soft whisper of wind through the stone walls. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for the words that would determine their future. "Your medical skills have saved lives that would otherwise have been lost," Grimwald continued. "Your diplomatic abilities have prevented conflicts that could have cost our people dearly. Your understanding of our laws and customs shows a respect for our traditions that goes beyond mere compliance." The elder paused, his gaze shifting to include Marcus in his attention. "And your performance in combat today demonstrated the kind of courage and determination that we value above all other qualities." Marcus felt Elena's grip on his hand tighten, her body tense with anticipation. Around them, the assembled tribe leaned forward, eager to hear the council's final judgment. "Therefore," Grimwald announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall, "it is the unanimous decision of this council that Lady Elena of Ravenshollow be granted full membership in the Stone Wolf tribe, with all the rights and responsibilities that such membership entails." The explosion of cheers and applause that followed nearly drowned out Grimwald's next words, but Marcus caught them anyway, and they sent his heart soaring higher than any victory in battle ever had. "Furthermore," the elder continued when the noise had died down enough for him to be heard, "the council recognizes the bond that has formed between our chieftain and this remarkable woman. If they choose to formalize that bond through marriage, they will have our blessing and support." Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief and joy. Elena turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks, her green eyes blazing with a happiness that seemed to light up the entire hall. Without caring about tribal protocol or the watching crowd, Marcus swept her into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing with the pure delight of impossible dreams coming true. When he finally set her back on her feet, Elena reached up to cup his face in her small hands, her touch gentle despite the calluses she had earned through months of training. "I love you," she whispered, her words meant only for him despite the hundreds of people surrounding them. "My giant warrior who brought me to my knees, just as surely as I brought him to his." Marcus leaned down to kiss her, pouring all of his relief and joy and love into the contact. Around them, the tribe erupted in fresh cheers, but he barely heard them. All that mattered was the woman in his arms, the future that stretched out before them, bright with possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus found himself looking into the eyes of the woman who had changed everything for him. Elena was no longer the frightened noble he had rescued from bandits. She was a warrior in her own right, a healer, a diplomat, a full member of his tribe who had earned her place through courage and determination. But more than any of that, she was the woman who had taught him that true strength came not from the ability to conquer others, but from the willingness to surrender to something greater than himself. The wedding ceremony 3 days later was unlike anything the Stone Wolf tribe had ever seen. Ancient traditions blended with customs Elena brought from her homeland, creating something new and beautiful that honored both their heritages. Marcus stood before the sacred fire wearing the formal armor of his ancestors, the metal polished to mirror brightness and inscribed with the deeds of generations of warriors. Elena wore a dress she had created herself, white silk embroidered with wolves running beneath stars, symbols that represented the joining of her former life with her chosen future. In her hair, she wore flowers from both the mountain peaks and the lowland valleys, a crown of living beauty that made her look like something from legend. As they spoke their vows before the assembled tribe, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a warrior who fought because it was what he was trained to do, a leader who commanded through fear and reputation. Now he was a man who fought for something precious, who led through love rather than intimidation. "I, Marcus of the Stone Wolf tribe, take you, Elena, to be my wife and my equal," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the great hall. "I promise to protect you not because you are weak, but because you are precious. I promise to stand beside you not because you need support, but because together we are stronger than either of us could be alone." Elena's vows were equally heartfelt, her voice steady despite the tears that sparkled in her green eyes. "I, Elena, formerly of Raven's Hollow, now of the Stone Wolf tribe, take you, Marcus, to be my husband and my partner. You saw strength in me when I saw only fear, saw beauty when I saw only scars. You taught me that surrender to love is not weakness, but the greatest courage of all." When Grimwold pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers that erupted from the tribe seemed to shake the very foundations of the stronghold. But Marcus barely heard them. All his attention was focused on Elena, on the smile that transformed her face and the love that shone in her eyes like starlight. The celebration that followed lasted until dawn, with feasting and dancing and storytelling that wove Elena's tale into the epic history of the tribe. Children who had been born during her trials would grow up hearing songs about the foreign princess who became a warrior, who proved that courage had nothing to do with the circumstances of birth and everything to do with the choices made in moments of testing. As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the mountains gold, Marcus and Elena finally escaped the festivities to walk the battlements they had paced during those anxious nights when her fate hung in the balance. Now those same stone walls seemed less like barriers and more like foundations, the beginning of something that would endure for generations. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked as they stood looking out over the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the tribal lands. "Giving up your old life, the comfort and luxury you were born to? Elena leaned against his side, fitting perfectly beneath his arm, as if she had been made to rest there. Never, she said without hesitation. That life was beautiful on the surface, but it was empty underneath. Here, I have purpose. I have meaning. I have you. Marcus tightened his arm around her, still amazed by the twist of fate that had brought her into his life. I never thought I would find this. Peace, contentment, the feeling that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. You found it because you were brave enough to admit you wanted it, Elena replied, tilting her head to look up at him. Most people spend their entire lives afraid to acknowledge what would truly make them happy, afraid that wanting it will somehow make them weak. Marcus considered her words, thinking about the man he had been before he met her. That Marcus had been strong in many ways, but he had also been hollow, going through the motions of life without truly living it. This Marcus, the one who had learned to surrender to love, felt more powerful than his predecessor had ever been. The council was right about one thing, he said finally. You have made me stronger. Not despite my love for you, but because of it. Elena smiled, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. And you have made me braver than I ever dreamed possible. Together we can face anything. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, painting the world in shades of hope and promise, Marcus held his wife close and thought about the future they would build together. There would be challenges ahead, conflicts with other tribes, the daily struggles of leadership and survival that were part of mountain life. But they would face them as partners, two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of their souls. The great warrior who had never bent the knee to any enemy had willingly knelt before the power of love, and in doing so had discovered a strength he never knew existed. Elena, the noble lady who had fled an unwanted marriage, had found the courage to fight for a life of her own choosing, proving that true nobility came from character rather than bloodline. Their story would be told around tribal fires for generations to come, a reminder that the greatest victories were not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when people chose love over fear, hope over despair, and the uncertain promise of tomorrow over the safe familiarity of yesterday. As they walked back toward the great hall where their people waited to begin another day, Marcus realized that he had finally found the answer to a question he had been carrying his whole life. Without knowing it, he had always wondered what it meant to be truly strong, what separated genuine power from mere force. Now he knew. True strength was not the ability to make others kneel, but the wisdom to recognize when something was worthy of your surrender. True power was not in commanding fear, but in inspiring love. And true victory was not in conquering enemies, but in finding someone who made you want to be better than you ever thought possible. The giant warrior had confessed his love and found his soul, and in losing himself to Elena, he had finally become the man he was always meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.